A black man walks down the street, minding his own business, when suddenly a police officer approaches and orders him to stop. What happens next will shock you. The cop, fueled by bias, arrests the man without cause, assuming he's just another victim of the system. But when they reach the courtroom, the tension shifts in an instant. The man, who was wrongfully detained and treated with disdain, is revealed to be the state's chief prosecutor. The officer, who thought he could get away with his actions, is left frozen in shock as the reality of who he's dealing with hits him. How did this encounter unfold? And what happens next when power, race, and justice collide in the courtroom? Stay tuned as we dive into a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the law. The cop had no idea who he was dealing with. Officer Matthews was known for his aggressive tactics, especially when it came to black men in his neighborhood. He'd seen this man before, always calm, always dressed sharply. But to him, that didn't matter. In Matthews' eyes, anyone walking through those streets was fair game. The arrest happened fast, too fast. No questions asked, just cuffs. But what Matthews didn't know was that this ordinary man had spent years climbing the ranks of the legal world. He wasn't just any black man. He was Daniel Harris, the state's chief prosecutor. Raised in the very same tough neighborhoods, Daniel had spent his career fighting to right the wrongs in a broken system. But this incident, this one arrest, was about to test everything he'd worked for. As the courtroom doors swung open, Daniel's calm demeanor met the officer's sudden realization everything had just changed. The courtroom fell silent as Daniel Harris entered. His presence was commanding, but it was the officer, Matthews, who was visibly shaken. The tension was thick enough to cut through with a knife. Daniel stood tall, but his mind was racing. He'd worked hard to get to this point, fighting for justice in a system that wasn't built for people like him. Yet here he was, standing in front of the very officer who represented everything he had been trying to change. Matthews shifted uncomfortably in his seat, still processing the shock. He hadn't just arrested any man. He'd arrested a man with the power to tear his career apart. But Matthews wasn't ready to back down. Despite the fear creeping into his chest, he tried to maintain his composure, convinced that his actions were justified. His history with minority communities made him certain he'd done the right thing. He had always seen himself as above reproach, until now. Meanwhile, Daniel's thoughts weren't just on revenge. He wasn't looking for a personal victory. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of his colleagues, the defense attorney, and the judge. This wasn't just about one officer or one wrong. This was about a system of racial injustice, one that had failed him and countless others time and time again. As much as Matthews had underestimated him, Daniel knew this moment could either be the spark for change or the confirmation that nothing had really shifted. But deep down, Daniel knew there was more at stake than Matthews' job. There were dangerous ripples this situation would cause, ripples that would affect the entire criminal justice system. How far would he be willing to push? And would Matthews be the one who would stand trial in the end, or would it be the entire corrupt system that had allowed this to happen in the first place? Daniel's decision, though unclear, would reshape the lives of everyone involved. The air in the courtroom felt suffocating as the prosecutor, Daniel Harris, stood up. His voice, steady yet piercing, echoed through the room. This isn't just about one officer's mistake. This is about the very system that allowed it to happen, he declared. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history, while Matthews clenched his fists, trying to steady the growing panic in his chest. Every eye in the room was now fixed on Daniel. He was no longer just a prosecutor. He was the embodiment of every black man wronged by the system, every injustice left unchecked. And if he pressed too hard, Matthews knew it could mean his career, his freedom, everything he had built, would come crashing down. Outside, the murmurs had turned into full-blown protests. The streets were alive with voices chanting, demanding accountability. Every day, the pressure built. And within the walls of the courthouse, that pressure was now focused on one pivotal moment, the decision Daniel would make. Would he push for the full weight of the law to come down on Matthews, knowing the consequences could shatter the fragile piece of his career? Or would he settle for something less, something safer, that might leave the deeper issues unchallenged? Inside the courtroom, the defense attorney was doing everything in his power to discredit Daniel. He was trying to paint him as a man who was too emotional, too personally invested in a case that had nothing to do with him. "This is a matter of law, not race," the attorney argued, his words laced with subtle, calculated dismissal. But Daniel wasn't hearing it. His focus was razor-sharp. He could feel the weight of his ancestors' struggles bearing down on him, the voices of the ones who never had a chance to speak up. Matthew's arrogance, his complete disregard for Daniel's humanity, stung deeply. The more the defense tried to deflect, the more Daniel knew he had to press forward. Matthews could feel the walls closing in. His mind raced, calculating his options, none of which seemed good. His reputation, built on years of doing things his way, was slipping through his fingers. He could see the way the other officers in the room were looking at him now, some with uncertainty, others with cold indifference. His pride had always been his armor, but now it was his weakness. The reality was sinking in. This wasn't just about being right anymore. It was about survival. And Daniel, he realized, wasn't going to stop until he made him pay. But there was something else, something that neither Daniel nor Matthews had expected. The judge, silent throughout most of the proceedings, suddenly stood up, his gavel striking the bench with a force that silenced everyone. Rivers stood still, staring directly at Daniel, before turning his attention to the judge. "This isn't just about an arrest. There's a much darker web behind this case. One that's tangled all the way to the top," he said, his voice cold and deliberate. The murmurs grew louder as the implications began to sink in. If Rivers was telling the truth, then everything, every move, every decision Daniel had made up until now, might be a distraction. This was no longer just about Officer Matthews' racism or Daniel's quest for justice. The stakes had just escalated beyond anyone's control. The detective reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. Without waiting for permission, he walked up to the bench and placed it in front of the judge. "This is what's been hidden from you," Rivers added. The judge took the envelope, his face unreadable. For a split second, the entire courtroom held its breath, the weight of the moment hanging heavily over them all. Daniel's heart pounded as the judge tore open the envelope. As he read, the silence stretched on, unbearably long. Then, without warning, the judge's expression shifted from stoic to something darker, more conflicted. He glanced up at Daniel, then at Rivers, his lips barely moving as he muttered, "We need to address this immediately." Daniel's mind spun. What had Rivers just revealed? What had he uncovered that could change the entire trajectory of this case? The shock on the judge's face was enough to send a wave of unease through the room. The tension was unbearable now. Then, in a final chilling twist, as the last few figures exited the room, Daniel's phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The message was simple, but it sent a chill through him. "Asterisk, they know what you found. They're coming for you next, asterisk." Daniel's heart raced, his mind flashing to the corruption that had been exposed, the names that would likely be silenced before they could do any real damage. The weight of the threat was unmistakable. This wasn't just about courtroom victories anymore. It was about survival. And now, with Rivers at his side, Daniel realized that the game had changed. What he'd uncovered was bigger than one man, bigger than one system. It was a war for control, and the true fight had only just begun. The gavel had fallen, but the real battle was only starting to take shape. Daniel Harris wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. He was a symbol of the fight for justice, whether he was ready or not. And with the clock ticking down, he had no choice but to step forward into the storm. The next chapter was already beginning, and it would be up to him to decide how far he would go. The question was no longer about winning. It was about surviving the truth. As the days passed, the shockwaves from the courtroom spread like wildfire. Daniel, with Rivers at his side, found himself thrust into a relentless pursuit of justice that went far beyond the corruption of one officer. With each revelation, the layers of deceit began to unravel, exposing a system of abuse that had plagued the community for years. The truth, once buried, was now out in the open, and Daniel's fight for reform became the fight for the city itself. Matthews, like many of those exposed, was swiftly removed from his position, but the damage was done.